All right. So now we're going to move through to the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. So this week we'll talk about morality of life and death. What I want to do to sort of start is for you guys to give me a definition of pro-life, what it means to be pro-life. And regurgitating that's not going to help. So, what does it mean to be pro-life? Like, how would you just, if someone says, "Hey, you're pro-life," what does that mean?
In favor of protecting the rights and dignity of life.
You can't use the word in the description. You can't use the word life in the description. That's the only rule. We have to be specific, more specific than that. So would you be in favor of I don't know, like, what if I back my car over like a fern? That's life. Yeah. Well, what about that?
I'd say, I guess, yeah, human life
Okay.
from its natural beginning to its natural end.
Okay.
Well, that's not true. From natural beginning to its rightly ordered end.
Okay. Anybody else want to try to hop in there? Connor was fumbling through that a little bit. What does it mean to be pro-life? All right, so we know what pro means. What does pro means for, right? What kind of life are we talking about? Human life. What specifically about human life? Because we have, in essence, we have two kinds of life in us, right? We have spiritual life and we have bodily life. So pro-life people, which one are they concerned with? First and foremost, yes, right? So this is part of it, right? So this is the part that we don't always grasp, right? Is that to be pro-life really means that you're, so let's take it from this way. So when we oppose something like abortion, right? We're opposed to it, not just because it kills a baby. That's really bad, right? We're opposed to it because of what it also does to the mother, to the doctor, to the annoying escort, to all the people that come in contact with in some way, how it touches them, what it does to them, what it turns them into, what it makes them into, and what it says about them and their eternity, right? So if we get caught up so much in the just, okay, we got to save human life, then it becomes really difficult to actually justify what some of the things we do. Yes.
So would you say it is worse for the baby or the mother during abortion? Because
Yeah, I think
it like kills the baby, but the mother will kill her soul.
Yeah, so I think in a certain respect, it's worse for the baby because we don't necessarily know what happens to the baby, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like yes, right. The mother still has time to repent, and God willing, she will. But that's the tragedy, the bigger tragedy, the tragedy of the child getting killed is horrible. I mean, I don't want to downplay that, but the greatest tragedy is the fact that the child never had a chance to even be born to be baptized. Right? And we believe what we believe. So that's why I went to the Benefit for Life the other night, which was Friday night. And I was just kind of reflecting about the way people were talking about abortion. And there, I was waiting to hear like a buzzword. And the buzzword I was looking to hear was hate. Right? I heard opposed, but I never heard hate. Like we should hate abortion, right? Not just be opposed to it as if it's something abstract and, like a policy or something like, like I'm opposed to, open borders or something, right? Like we need to hate it because of what it does. Okay. And there's a second reason why there's a case. So I want to read this quote and then I want to shift to another reason why we have to be clear about what it really means to be pro-life. So in Evangelium Vitae, John Paul II says, life in time, in fact, is the fundamental condition, the initial stage, and an integral part of the entire unified process of human existence. It is precisely this supernatural calling which highlights the relative character of each individual's earthly life. So he's saying what we just said, right? He's just simply saying that the earthly life is relative to the spiritual or eternal life. After all, life on earth is not an ultimate, but a penultimate, right? I'm going to keep coming back to that idea. Life on earth is not an ultimate, but a penultimate reality. Even so, it remains a sacred reality entrusted to us to be preserved with a sense of responsibility and brought to perfection in love and in the gift of ourselves to God and to our brothers and sisters. All right. So life on earth is not an ultimate, but a penultimate. Okay. Everyone knows what penultimate means, like not the highest thing, right? Okay. So you probably all have heard of what is called the seamless garment. Anyone not heard of that? Okay, so the seamless garment theory is, I'll read what the Cardinal from Chicago, how he defined it. He called it a consistent ethic of life, and then later on it sort of got adopted to the seamless garment. The idea of a seamless garment is you tug one string and the whole thing falls apart, right? He says a consistent ethic of life does not equate the problem of taking life through abortion and in war with the problem of promoting human dignity, but a consistent ethic identifies both the protection of life and its promotion as moral questions. It argues for a continuum of life which must be sustained in the face of diverse and distinct threats. Okay, what's the problem with what he's saying? I want you to pick this apart a little bit, because there's people who make decisions. We see it every time, like we come around to vote, right? Where they equate certain things and they say, well, you can't be pro-life and be, what we're going to talk about, and be in favor of capital punishment because it's still killing someone, right? And that's the principle behind it. But what are they doing when they talk about this? Yes.
One thing he does when he gives the examples is this: their abortion and war. Those are two very distinct categories. One is never listed directly, and the other could be listed directly.
Okay. So what is, yes, right.
It's to be used.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, Katie.
Exact words you use, but is it like the difference between being a problem and right, like the right to not be killed versus a right to like some. I don't know.
Okay, go a little deeper, because I think what you're saying is like you're onto something,
Yes.
but can you get an example? The negative versus the positive. Yes.
That's different than having the right to healthcare. Like one is a right that you have to be in person, and the second is a right that is provided to you like by society.
Okay, so that is definitely part of it. Definitely, like there's sort of a level of what is intrinsic and what is either given to you or part of citizenship or something like that. Yes.
I don't know. It seems as though it's not being looked at through the lens of justice, especially like in regards to war.
For sure.
Capital punishment.
For sure. So why was I nitpicking on the word life when I asked the question earlier? Has anyone figured that out? Because he's equivocating on the word life, right? He's confused. He's thinking, okay, bodily life, that's it. Like, and if on the surface level, right, abortion and dying in war, bodily life, same thing, right? Abortion, Saint Joan of Arc killed in a war, they're the same thing, right? So war can actually be a meritorious thing, right? Abortion, never, right? So you can't equate those two things, right? Because they're looking at things on a different level. Because ultimately, you know what? The worst thing that happens to you is not that you die. We're all going to die. The worst thing is that you end up in hell, right? Like that is the worst thing that can happen to you. And if we don't forget that, then suddenly there is a ranking, right? And we're going to come back to this when we talk about capital punishment at the end. But if you're just looking at it from like a this world perspective, abortion and capital punishment, poverty, all those issues, they all look like they're the same thing. But looked at from the perspective of heaven, they're on completely and totally different levels, right? Blessed are the poor, right? Think about that for a second, right? And that doesn't mean, okay, there's someone poor, let's just leave them alone because they're working on their sainthood. But they have a path to sanctity. The child in the womb never had a path to sanctity. The person at the end of their life who's being euthanized had their path to sanctity cut off. And that's a way bigger deal than if, again, not to trivialize it, but than someone who lives a life of poverty and ends up dying in poverty. Still not good, but totally different thing. All right. And if we are going to be concerned first and foremost about the salvation of souls, then we aim in those places where that's in jeopardy. Okay. Yes. Here.
If you don't want to get into this, then it's fine, but a priest told me that limbo is defined as like a level 2 doctrine or something in the Council of Trent. So we have to believe it as Catholics. You know if that's true?
I mean,
The trend order stuff.
I don't know. I don't know that I've ever seen that it was. I mean, the only thing I've ever seen is that, so not to get too far off. So limbo is just like, according to reason, limbo makes sense, right? But you don't think it makes sense. If we have no other data, to me, it makes sense. But we could talk about it at the end and then come back to it if you want. I don't think it is. I could be wrong. But
A priest 100% told me that. I almost started crying. He was like, "That's true."
why didn't you cry in front of him? Make him
I
walk it
think I might
back.
have.
Yeah, you should have
I
made him
think I
walk it
may
back.
have.
Well, did you take it into the girl chat room afterwards? Girls who hate the priest who likes limbo. We can talk more about that at the end if you want. I'm not. I totally forget. They were like.
You did it on purpose.
No, they said to me totally. They said Keegan's not even here, and I said, but what if he shows up?
I bet Nicholas $5 in the car. I didn't take the bet.
I'm not gonna lie, there's a part of me that was like, would it be weird if I just totally interrupted you speaking when I get here?
Yeah, it would be weird if you did it because that's Keegan's job.
Exactly.
Yeah, but not weird at all in general. Thank you, Keegan. That was awesome. All right. So seamless garment. All right. Totally different issues on totally different levels. And so we need to not fall for that. I don't know how I got all wrapped up here. All right. So what I want to do, the 3 things I want to talk about are the 3 obvious ones: abortion, euthanasia, and capital punishment. All right, we're going to spend probably more time on abortion. And what I want to do is kind of deviate a little bit from sort of Catholic doctrine. And I want to actually pull some stuff out of Roe versus Wade, since this is kind of up for debate right now. And just so you all can kind of know what was going on, why the decision was made. And believe it or not, like now with COVID is not the first time that we pretended to talk about science. All right, so here we go. So first of all, okay, so I'm personally opposed, but there's not anyone in this room that buys that, right? Okay, what's the problem with it?
Also, I can't remember if he stated it or the press secretary did, but they're like, he actually revised that because so like the president doesn't think the conception starts or that life starts at conception. So that statement is
Okay.
no longer.
That's a shame. Because that was the hinge point. He was so close to changing his mind just on that. Yeah. No, thank you. So what's the problem with that? Yes,
He said, I'm personally opposed.
I'm personally opposed to
So that's
abortion.
part of the quote?
Yeah,
Oh.
essentially he says, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I can't force my views on everybody else.
Well, if he believes that if he believes that abortion is wrong.
Okay, everybody agree with that?
something that's logically wrong with that. Because he says that I do not believe that we have a right to tell other people, women, that they cannot control their body. When if he actually accepted the teaching that life begins at conception, then he would not be able to view that abortion is only a matter of a woman's control over her own body.
Yeah, so there's a sophistry going on for sure. Do we enforce our views on other people? Yeah, that's what law is called. Law does that all the time, right? Law, like, I think it's wrong to murder someone. Well, what do you know? There's a law that says that. Like, so we enforce morality all the time on other people. Yeah. Yeah. So, and then secondly, yes, Ryan.
I just realized it said, I just realized on equally about Christians, Muslims, and Jews. I just refused to do that. But I think I hear it better. Devout Christians, Muslims, and Jews are all called to hold the same.
Sort of. Like Jews are not opposed to abortion in general. Yeah. Yeah, and Muslims are up to some amount of time.
Other Muslims are like
Well,
discussions.
this would be the problem of not having like a magisterium, right? Like it's, I mean, you know, there's also like Muslims that think you can't take a bath in front of your dog because you're naked in front of the dog and you have to stay in the bathtub until the dog leaves the room, right? So,
Well, I mean, like, a little bit like Ryan's point, it's like Muslims, like, or Jews can't kill people. Like, we don't change the laws because of your religion. It's like, and it's not like we just cave to it. Like, if anyone disagrees with this, we're gonna change all the laws to make them happy. So we wouldn't have any laws.
It's still not okay for extremists.
okay, so there's two things going on here that I want to point out. The first is that he's appearing to remain neutral. Okay, is there any such thing as neutrality when it comes to the law? No, right? So not neutral. The second mistake he's making is he's making it just to be a religious issue. Is abortion just a religious issue? No, right? Like we can make really good arguments that don't even invoke religion at all, right?
Even if there was a religion that said it's okay to murder people, it doesn't mean like, oh,
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing with like, doesn't our religion say thou shalt not kill? Like, is that a religious view then? That, you know, then we should take that on, just remain neutral. Yes, Connor and Michael.
But just to kind of build on that's the problem with like kind of the idea of like religious tolerance as being like the cornerstone of just because you know Satanists say, well, actually abortion is a part of my religion, and you have to let me perform abortions. And also Jews don't. I thought in the Old Testament it said that if you like hit a woman who was pregnant and like I thought
Yeah, my understanding is most, like, again, Judaism is not monolithic at all, but most are in favor of abortion. Yes, and I'm pretty sure, like in the state of Israel, that I mean they have abortion.
I mean, like sort of with that point, like the Mormons with polygamy in the Supreme Court, like no, you can't do that.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So he mentioned the Supreme Court. So let's take a look at that. All right. So everyone knows sort of Roe versus Wade, 1973, made abortion legal at any point throughout pregnancy. And in the past year, I actually decided I would read what they wrote, just because I was interested to see like what the arguments were. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that. So I want to read this one quote out of it, and then we'll just sort of talk about it for a minute. So the Aristotelian theory. So one of the things they did, the argument they did. All right. So they went back through time, supposedly to prove that we can't know when life begins. No, this is the decision. Yeah. So this is everything I'm going to give you is like you could go and written decision by Judge Harry Blackmun is who wrote the majority decision. The argument essentially goes, they have 18 pages of history. All right. And he goes from Moses to St. Thomas Aquinas. All right. Interestingly enough, he stops at St. Thomas Aquinas.
This is a good place to stop.
And then, well, we'll get to that in a second.
He's up before. Or
After. So whatever was believed in 1274 allegedly is what he would say is, and we'll see why he did that in a second. So the Aristotelian theory of mediate animation, right? Mediate animation just simply means that, okay, so when does the soul enter? Let's sort of grasp the Catholic teaching. When does the soul enter the body? Conception. Why?
That's when the soul's in the form of the body, and now that now that system is associated with it.
Okay. So if I were to flip that and say, okay, I think the soul enters the body, which is what Aristotle thought, or let's take the Muslim view of 40 days. I think it's 40 days. Whatever it is. Okay. What's the problem with that? Other than it's wrong. Yeah. Go ahead, Kevin. What were you gonna say?
Yeah, it's because we know from the science that like it's that baby isn't just two cells anymore. What it can do, what it does, the direction it's headed in, its potential, and how it progresses show you that it is substantially changed into something else right away when the two cells met and the child was formed. If it weren't, then you would just have two cells and nothing would happen, like when a pregnancy isn't achieved.
All right. So flipping what Kevin said, he's exactly right. So if it's 120 days, 20 days, whatever it is, what is the thing before that happens? Right? It has to have a form, to Andrew's point. What is it? Right? Which ultimately this is the fundamental question, right? And so when you hear someone say something like Aristotle thought this, St. Thomas Aquinas thought this, they're right? So St. Thomas thought it was later, but his reason for thinking later was biological, not philosophical, right? He didn't know that the body it was an actual human body from the moment of conception, okay? So in other words, if you say it's 20 days in, 60 days in, you have to tell me what it was before. And you have to tell me at what point it changed into human, okay? Yeah, what caused the change, even if it's just natural, and when did it change? All right, go ahead, Connor.
Is the media animation theory, is that where they think it goes from animal to animal?
Yeah, so souls, plants have souls. I think we've talked about it before. If I have, you guys can stop me. Plants have souls, animals have souls, all living things have a soul, right? But plants have vegetative souls, which means they have vegetative powers only, right? Animals have animal souls, but they also have vegetative powers, right? They eat, they're alive, obviously. And then the rational soul also has the animal powers. It has emotions and locomotion and all in passions, and it's alive, it's vegetative, right? So there's this hierarchy of souls, right? And so mediate animation essentially said, it starts out as this thing that's alive, so it has a soul. But then when it gets to a certain point, when it's actually becomes human, or the body is sufficiently organized such that it could take in a rational soul, then it becomes a person. All right, that's the idea of mediate animation. Go ahead.
So, that's why Thomas Aquinas didn't believe in the conception. But beyond that, beyond that,
It's exactly why.
is there,
Because the science said that's actually not, the body actually isn't formed at conception, it's formed sometime later.
so could someone who holds media animation, because I'm assuming Aquinas wasn't pro-choice up to 120, whatever the science.
No, he thought abortion was wrong no matter what. Anyway, like from the moment. No, it's not, and it's not even, it's misrepresenting what at least Aquinas thought, right? Aquinas said abortion was wrong no matter what, no matter when it was performed. So it's, but you'll see what he's trying to do when we sort of progress.
And what was his argument? Just because now the argument is, well, it's a person, you can't kill a person. Well, obviously you don't have that argument with media animation. So do you know what his argument was for why it was wrong?
Because Revelation said it was, because it was it was divine revelation said it was wrong. Abortion was always wrong. And some of it was also to, I mean, he would have argued from like a contraceptive argument of where to destroy the, what's the word he would use? Well, it's destroying like the products of, I hate to use products, but in his mind, to destroy the products of conception is just as bad as actually destroying like a conceived person, right? So very like understanding of, okay, it's the same thing as spilling your seed on the ground. He would say that still is wrong. And so if it wasn't a person, it would then be a contraceptive act, and in his mind, it would still be bad. All right, so in essence, what they start with, okay, is basically saying, okay, nobody knew when life began. This is what he's trying to get at, right? He's trying to create this sort of skepticism of no one's ever known when life began, although the Catholic Church now has a dogma that says life began at conception. Does the Catholic Church actually have a dogma that says life began at conception? No, because we can reason to it, right? We don't need a dogma for that, okay? All right, let's go a little bit deeper into Roe versus Wade. So notice what he does, okay? And I'm really summarizing here. He says, we don't need to resolve the difficult question of when life begins. This is the Supreme Court saying this. Doesn't matter. We don't have to figure it out. When those trained in respective disciplines of medicine, philosophy, and theology are unable to arrive at any consensus, the judiciary at this point in the development of man's knowledge is not in a position to speculate as to answer. All right, so he's saying, look, nobody really has a consensus as to when life begins, which is a lie. Because if you stop medical science in the year 200 and stop philosophy in 1200, yeah, there's no consensus, right? Substantial problems. Now here he goes with the little skeptics argument. Substantial problems for precise definition of this view are posed, however, by new embryological data that purport to indicate that conception is a process over time. All right, so he's saying, well, science has brought up new questions about conception really just being a process and not a moment. Yeah, but if you Powers in the footnote, right? If you look, his sources for this are 5 court cases, not very scientific, and 2 secular scientists. In other words, scientists who are not actually trained embryologists. In fact, for at least 100 years going up to Roe versus Wade, it was known that life began at conception. They were not that behind. Okay, so what he did is create this skepticism that makes it look like it's okay. All right, so he's already stacking the deck. Yes, Ryan.
Just to add some, it's sort of like learning about like the conception. What the egg does, like, so there's a process of like there's different jelly-like substances around the egg, like other stuff. So it's a process for the sperm to actually get through. But once there are certain receptors and proteins and layers and stuff on the outside of the sperm and egg that are species specific, there's a fusion that happens and the DNA is like pushed in, and the egg is instantaneously like automatically responding to like their voltage changes because ions are released and different stuff. So like there are videos of like flashes occurring at fertilization. That's because there's a major like -60 volts up to like 15 and then down to 0 for a good bit of time to prevent other sperm from coming in. There are physiological changes that are like proteins and shells are basically being formed around the egg to prevent other sperm from getting in. And the cell like gets to work immediately to start rearranging of like, okay, new DNA is here, centrioles are here. Centrioles are these things that like pull chromosomes apart during cell division. Like those are already activating the spindle fibers that are necessary for division. The process happens. It's a bit of a process to like get the sperm into physical contact and binding with the egg, once it happens, it all jumps into action.
Yeah, and no one is saying like the moment of consent, like, my understanding is that could take anywhere from like 1 to 30 minutes, for example, right? Like I mean, it does, it's not like, it's not, no one ever said moment of consent, like moment is not that's not a word you use for like just all of a sudden, but we all would agree there were two things, now there's one. There's no disputing that, right? And we go back again, what is the one thing that was created? Yes, Connor.
So kind of, I mean, just without even taking into the science, there's going to kind of natural reasoning. I mean, if we use the word conception to represent the transition from like, the two things to the one thing, that can't be a process. There has to be, like, there always has to be something.
Yeah, at some point, there is a point of change,
Yeah.
right? Whenever that is, but to Ryan's point, like, that can be disputed. And if someone wants to argue with me that you can have an abortion in those 30 minutes, maybe I could go, I don't know, like, maybe you could, maybe that's still contraceptive and it's wrong, but maybe you didn't have an abortion, right?
I guess that would be the point. So either you did it before the moment, in which case it's contraception, you did it after the moment, in which case it's abortion.
Yeah.
But it always has to be like on one. I guess what I'm saying, because he seems to be making I guess you could call like probably an inherently materialist argument that says, well, really, we're all just kind of a continuum of chemical reactions, and so this whole conception business is just this series of chemical reactions that has to occur.
Well, and what worldview speaks in processes? Like, things don't actually happen, they're processes. Like, that's an evolutionary way to look at things, right? So that the human being is just kind of evolutionarily coming out of this act. So the point is, though, we don't necessarily, what he's saying at the end there doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how long it takes. At a certain point, it was two different things, sperm and egg, and then it's not. Then it's one thing, all right? And we have to go back and we have to ask the question, what is that one thing? All right, and we're going to get into that question, all right? All right, so what I want to do is we're going to do arguments against abortion, and then we'll do some of the, we'll talk a little bit about some of the arguments for abortion, and we'll talk about them. All right, so the first premise is scientific. All right, human life begins at conception. The second premise is moral. All humans have the right to life because, well, they are humans. And the third is a legal premise, and that's that the law must protect the most basic of human rights, including the right to life. And so if we can, if you can refute one or two, then three would naturally sort of follow. Yes.
Just in your experience, from which do you
I guess
think,
three
which of
didn't
the
come up
three
there.
premises is most likely to be rejected? Because I would think, you know, most people are probably going to have an issue with the, I guess they probably go with the first one.
Yeah, go ahead.
I actually had a bunch of discussions with this about my roommate, I guess, junior year. And from what I found, it seems as though there's a number of people who aren't necessarily disputing the fact that like life begins at conception, that because it's not like rational in the way that we are, or because its rationality isn't like actual but only potential, that they don't think that it's like deserving of the same dignity and rights that like rational adults are. So I would say the second one. I would say the second one's probably. And then you look at issues like euthanasia and assisted suicide that are really related to like not granting that second premise. So,
Yeah, and we'll come back to like both of those, like, and we'll dig in a little deeper. Yes, Ryan.
There are also scientific papers that have written about this that literally start out acknowledging scientifically no conception.
Yep, I know we know that.
And
Yep.
like they'll accept it, like people will often accept that full send, and then the rest of the paper was justifying abortion.
The strongest arguments now I've seen are like those that appeal to probably that problem. Because it's pretty easy to prove that things are conception.
All right, so I don't know that I put any bodily autonomous arguments in here. We can talk about those if you guys want to when we get to the end. All right, so let's just again go back to Roe versus Wade. Recall though, don't forget this, we don't really need to resolve the difficult question of when life begins, but it really all hinges on where life begins. So like the little schizophrenic manner in which he's arguing, if the suggestion of the personhood of the preborn is established, then the case, of course, collapses. For the fetus's right to life is then guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment. Right, so we don't really need to worry about it, but if we do realize, well, then the whole question hinges on it. All right, so this would be the path that everybody agrees on, right? Like if it's really a person, unless you're really twisted up, then if it's really a person, then they deserve the right to life. Okay, and if they don't agree with that, we sort of have a little bit bigger issues, right? All right, so let's back up then and look at the scientific premise. And we could do this really all day long, and I'm not going to. But what I'm going to do is just sort of take a couple of quotes from around the time of Roe versus Wade, just to kind of show, okay, where were they thinking? All right, how many of you know who Dr. Bernard Nathanson was? Yeah, he was a co-founder of NARAL, but he had a conversion, and he sort of spilled the beans when he had the conversion, right? Yes.
What is NARAL?
National Abortion Rights, no, National something Abortion Rights, National Abortion Right. I forget the second A is League.
Okay, I got the gist.
Yeah. So he was actually the one, how many of you know at least of the movie called Silent Scream? Okay, so Silent Scream is actually someone in the late 80s, early 80s actually, probably, did an ultrasound, and then they made it into a movie. And it was, the ultrasound was of them trying to abort the child. And it's really kind of gruesome. But you can literally see the child screaming as the saline's injected into them. And so it's called Silent Scream. It's pretty powerful. I probably wouldn't recommend it. Like, but he was the one who made this. And I think he said 35,000 abortions he was responsible for in his life.
NARAL stands for or at least originally stood for the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, but they apparently no longer use that one. It's just NARAL without standing for anything.
Okay, so he was integral in getting Roe versus Wade going. And he essentially said, modern technologies have convinced us that beyond the question, the unborn child is simply another human being, another member of the human community, indistinguishable in every way from any of us. US Senate report, this is 1981, so 6, 7, 8 years later. Physicians, biologists, and other scientists agree that conception marks the beginning of the life of a human being, a being that is alive and is a member of the human species. There's overwhelming agreement on this point in countless medical, biological, and scientific writings. All right, so Roe versus Wade says one thing, somehow the Senate came to a vastly different conclusion. All right, so how can we argue this a little bit and not get bogged down in either arguments from authority or just keep quote after quote after quote. All right, so there's two, I think, ways you can sort of look at this scientifically. The first is that whatever that thing is, that unborn entity is biologically distinct from its parents. All right, what does that mean? It means it is unified, self-integrating human organism, meaning it has its own DNA. And now the only thing it needs for growth and development is the same thing we need: water, food, oxygen, and a healthy interaction with its natural environment. All right. Remember, Roe versus Wade said substantial problems there's substantial problems for the precise definition of. So all you got to do, argument, two things became one thing, right? What is that one thing? Well, we know scientifically what it is, right? Has its own DNA. It's going to expand, and everything that person will be is already there. Nothing comes in from the outside. It doesn't transform into something else. And so its DNA is different from its mother's and its father's, and it needs no new genetic info from that point forward. And then just to grow, it just needs the same stuff we need to survive, right? Delivered in a different way, but nevertheless, same idea. All right, going deeper, what is called the law of biogenesis, which simply just means that reproduction occurs such that things reproduce of their own kind. All right, ducks have ducks. Right? There's no, not velociraptors. So again, if that is not a human being, what is it? And how did two human beings reproduce something that's not a human being? Okay, simple, not bogged down in the science. Okay, so you can imagine someone saying, okay, well that's fine, but it's still different. Okay, so let's talk about what the differences are between an unborn child and a child running around outside. Okay, first we would say, okay, size, right? Unborn child really small, 5-year-old child big. Okay. Anywhere else we make any moral distinction based on the size of someone? No, right? Like am I any less of a person than LeBron James because he's taller and bigger than me? No, right? Okay. So we say, okay, size isn't morally relevant. What about level of development? Okay, so is a 7-year-old more of a person than a 2-year-old? How about me more of a person than you? No. Some people would argue that. I agree. Yeah, so we need to go back to this, to Matthias's point too, and we'll come back to it. So that one is maybe questionable, although again, you'd have to give me an example. Okay, so level of development has no moral standing, right? Okay, so let's look at the environment. Does it really matter where you are? Right? Does a man in Tahiti, is he any less of a person than a woman in Toronto? No, so environment doesn't have anything to do with it, right? So again, unborn child is inside the womb, just in a different place. Okay. What about degree of dependency? That's the fact that one is dependent on others for survival determine their personhood. So the fact that an older man is on dialysis, is he any less of a person than an 18-year-old? No, right? Okay, so in what other ways then are unborn children different from us? Can you think of any other than these 4? Yes, Ryan.
This can go under, I guess, development, but I've heard people talking about baby like fetuses and just looking, oh, they look like an elephant, which is a totally superficial sort of thing, but they see, like, we'll show them, here, look, this is like what a baby looks like at 8 weeks old, at 22 weeks old. They're like, no, that thing's disgusting. It looks like an alien worm creature thing.
Yeah, I guess you could just ask them what they look like at 20 days or 60 days. Yeah.
I'm not saying.
Yeah.
Arguments.
Categorize like exercise and rational faculties under level of development.
Sure.
That's what I was thinking as well, but the problem is if say a kid under whatever reasons like 5 or something.
Yeah. You also have to
I
say
would say there's also
every night when you go to bed, you're no longer a person.
right. So the other, the reason why I don't know that like I would exactly categorize under it, but that is because it can be like adults who are boy developed and then like run an accident or something and then impairs them. So I don't know that that's like exactly development.
Well, I mean, it is like, because if they continue on that progression, right? Like at any point that progression could be stunted. But the point is, even if it is stunted, it still doesn't make them any less, right? Just like how when you go to bed at night and can't use your reasoning skills any longer, then you're still a person, right? You don't shut off your personhood and then, like murdering a sleeping person is the same thing as murdering a live person, right? Yes, Patrick.
I guess this is sort of just me, but like if I guess kind of devil's advocate, like if I were to like attack this, I guess the angle I go from is sort of like that immediate animation where I try convincing that not that like it's not alive, not that the soul of it is sort of, I guess, like a vegetative soul or like an animal soul, where it's not a human soul, because it doesn't have that rational power.
Mhm.
If that's sort of like what like not a big difference.
Yeah, so does the, and I would counter with the fact that it has, does a person have to be exercising their rationality in order to have a rational soul?
But it has to have the ability, it
Yeah.
has to-
Yeah, the capability.
they don't really have.
Yeah, but what if they're
That's-
currently not, but they're currently not using it? They do have the capability, right? They're currently unable to use it, right? So in other words, it's no different than when you go under anesthesia, right? It's just in a different way. You still have the potency, to use a Thomistic term. It just hasn't been actualized yet.
I think what he's getting at isn't like potency versus actuality, but like biological capability, whereas like when you go to sleep, like you still have a brain that functions, you're just not using it, whereas a embryo doesn't have like fully formed brain that is like fully like biologically capable of reasoning in a way that adults can, is
Yeah,
where his argument's coming from.
Exactly. You take a 2-day-old baby, it's not gonna start like spouting out Aquinas' proofs for why God and so like there's no, it doesn't have the ability to think.
Yeah, but what about somebody with Down syndrome?
I've heard people make similar arguments.
But they're not a person?
Or that they're like less of a person than some people. Yeah, there's countries that like allow euthanasia.
Yeah, that reasoning always has to so there are logical consequences to abortion, and that's one of them, right? And we need to understand that. You know, there's countries like Nordic countries, which they're bragging about being almost 100% Down syndrome free.
They cured it.
Yeah, they cured it by killing everyone who had it.
I'm worried with, when we bring up these arguments like, oh, well, you wouldn't kill a 2-year-old, is if we're ever gonna get to the point where society has become so immoral that you can no longer use that kind of like, oh, maybe we should, like, oh, maybe they're gonna kill.
Well, but it's just a logical consequence, right? Like there's a professor at Princeton, I think his name is Peter Singer, who's a total atheist. And he's always chiding pro-choice people for not actually like living up to what they believe. And he argues that exactly. He's like, look, 2-year-olds, there's no reason why you can't kill them. It's like they're not fully people yet.
You know, I
Go ahead.
think you've already seen people make the argument that like, because normally people, the pretend line, people is like, okay, well, once the child's born, then you definitely can't do it. We've already seen people say like, okay, well, once the child's born, then we'll have this,
Yeah.
we'll have a discussion with the mother about what's gonna happen to the child.
But those are like the governor of Virginia.
Yeah, so I mean, it's we're already there.
Yeah. There are people who are like, who cares, it's a kid, just come.
Yeah, so like, I mean, the reason why we're doing this, right? I am not going to convince the governor of Virginia that he's wrong because for him, it's all about power, right? But am I going to convince many, many other people who are still people of goodwill? Yeah, right. So don't think like, because here's the thing, right? When someone has bad will, evil intent, you can't argue with them anyway, right? There's no arguing with someone who has evil intent. The only way that you can argue with them is just repeat the truth, repeat the truth, repeat the truth, right? There's no arguments because they're not reasoning to that place anyway. They're just exercising power. So I mean, a lot of this is for our own personal sort of understanding, but also to grasp, okay, like it's the people who are not in power that need to, because I don't want, like, if you make this argument to one person outside of the abortion clinic and they turn around, man, that, like, you just saved a life, right? Like, so it doesn't matter. Like, I know we want like big grand things, but that's probably not how it's going to happen anyway, right? All right, anything else like related to this? And the little acronym is SLED. Just remember that. What are you gonna say, Keith?
We have difficulty arguing 1 and 2 because there's no, for example, like the extreme, you can't go younger or like less developed than embryo, you can't go smaller than embryo, and so it's like I have difficulty making that argument because while I can say there's obviously not like what do you call it, a range or
Gradient.
what's that?
A gradient.
Yeah, like, there's not a spectrum of how the person's value as a human or whatever. Obviously, because if that was the case, then someone who was shorter or way less or smaller or whatever would be less than a person who's bigger or taller. We know we don't see that, but it's like, it still leaves the potential for at a certain size, someone just stops, like, they're just like.
Yeah, but the point, right, is that when you're talking about this, like the burden of proof is on them in the sense that you go, okay, everywhere I look, it doesn't make a difference. Why does it make a difference here? Right, so that's what, this is not I mean, this is more of like an inductive way of reasoning, right? Where you essentially say, I don't see any moral reason why these two things are different, and they agree with you. And so then they have to tell you why it's different, right? So yeah, you're right. Like because there are people who don't agree with that. Like, and this isn't the way to get to them. Yes, Connor.
I was gonna say, this is kind of building on, I think you mentioned it earlier, the kind of balance of probably is on there, so I think there's a person I've had conversations about this with, and their supposed holdup would kind of probably fall under the fourth, where it's basically it's too much of a burden on the mother. Like I could never force some woman, young girl, to go through a pregnancy, basically either because and so basically the degree of dependency I granted you. I think you can make a strong argument for the person who's on life support. Like I'm sure that puts a great deal of stress upon the number of people that can support them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the argument still then is, or at least the reasoning is, well, there's plenty of help for her, right? Like, yeah, it's an unbelievable burden, but we actually have ways we can help her. But you know that means then you got to agree that what your objection is real, like that it's a really big burden on the mother, if that's really the reason, and then you say, okay, well, I'll lighten the burden.
Which takes us even to another level where now people will basically say it's an irreparable. Basically, it's okay. Look, this woman's life now. She can't go to college. She can't have a career. And again, we can make discussions about whether those things are really important. What makes life worth living and what makes life important. But those are the things. I mean, because you see people saying like, oh, this woman, this girl's. Her future is now ruined by this. How can we ruin her entire future?
Well, and you can see, like, going back to the last time we met, the degradation of maternity, right? Yeah. That actually her life is going to be 1,000 times richer because she's actually doing what she was made for, right? And instead of getting pulled into something else, right? Yes, Ryan.
About like if we were to visit that, I don't think I've read too much about it because I don't think anyone anything.
Yeah, exactly. But like I'm just saying, for me, where it's like I always like to sort of come up with like a devil's advocate.
Yeah, you should.
Yeah, no,
like that's healthy.
Totally good on you. Yeah. Just into like I don't need to worry.
Yeah,
I don't think you're gonna come up with any advocate at that level.
Yeah, but I guess like to my point too is different. Like there's one little thing I'm like a little bit caught up on is if somebody was like if somebody was to like make a distinction between like the whatever 40-day child or 40-day embryo that's 40 days in development versus that like first moment of conception is like if they attack that sort of the soul is sort of like I don't know exactly when brain development or like brain functionality starts in the embryo, but there is a difference between like the brain development of 40-day-old where they have the ability to feel pain or whatever, something like that, where that shows there's rationality in there, but like a 2-day-old embryo doesn't have that. So I guess what my argument is to point that was accurate. At one stage, it doesn't have the rationale, like the tools for rationale.
So what are the tools for rationality though? So like, here's why I would respond to that. They actually do have them. They're just not, like, they already have the coding for them. They're just not there, right? So in the midst of building something, for example, right? Would you say, okay, I don't know, the chimney's not built yet, right? This isn't a house.
I would say, like, if I were to like sort of use the argument before, I would say that this house is sort of like, not like a, I guess maybe like a lower type of house, but once it gets that chimney, then.
But still a house though, right? Like, see, you see what I'm saying? Like, so you have to tell me what it is, if it's not that.
Yeah, but I think kind of.
I would say like it's a like to use what I've been saying before, I'd say it's a vegetative house versus a sort of a human house, you know what I mean, where it's like.
Yeah, so part of the identity of it,
It's an artifact,
yeah,
so it's still
yeah, but part of the identity of a thing is also what it turns into, right? So like, part of why we call an acorn is because of what it's turning into versus, you know, a rock.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm just saying, like, my argument is that it is turning into a human, but at that state, it isn't a human.
It,
That's
so
not-
the other part too would be, okay, why would you pick, why is the brain so integral to your definition?
for rationality.
So that's what I was gonna say is like biologically, how do we determine the difference between an animal soul and human soul? What's that? Yeah, and so like you, I don't see how we can say there's not a fully developed brain, so it's an animal, not a human. Or like, because when it has a fully developed brain, that doesn't make it human. Like, 'cause all animals have.
Well, not, yeah, but not human brains,
some
right?
Animals have brains. But there's nothing, from what I understand of our understanding of like biology and psychology, we don't understand where rationality comes from.
So 2 points. One, that's not going to be a hot take. Is actually related again back to no, at the stage of one egg, it's not like you have the brain developing necessarily, but it's not just like, oh, you have the DNA to eventually have that happen. There are maternal determinants, so there are proteins spaced out in the egg in certain areas, such that once conception happens, those proteins mean that as the cell starts to divide, that area of the cell between the multiple cells are already programmed to become like what will eventually be the brain. That's already determined before the sperm even gets there. So like that's not really proven right.
Yeah, so what,
It's
so,
already determined.
so Patrick, so I'd ask, so why did it develop the brain in 40 days?
Was or I guess that's just its end, or sort of like getting at a specific.
Well, my question would be like, why didn't it develop a monkey brain? Or why didn't it develop a brain stem? Or why did it develop that and not something else?
It's just, like, going back to the biogenesis, like it is like I'm not denying.
Well, no, I know you're not denying it, right?
Yeah.
No, but the point is, it is the kind of thing that only that kind of thing. So you can never get out of the fact that it developed the brain because it's a human. Like it's an endless loop. You just keep backing up. Like you just keep going back and back. Well, why did it develop that brain and not the brain of a whale?
Yeah, but again, like I don't think his point is necessarily that like how human it is, but that like because it he can't do this thing that like generally all like humans can do, therefore it's
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about this, but ultimately the
psychological-
error is in thinking, because you have to then, okay, let's get the logical conclusion. You're measuring function. Does function determine what a thing is?
Yeah, the argument isn't the function determines what the thing is, but the function determines value. Let's say is the argument that it is.
Yeah.
Or potentially like life, like.
Yeah, because action follows from being, not the other way around, right? So a thing does a certain thing because of the kind of thing it is. Like that's how I would counter that. I would say, okay, why did it develop a human brain and not something else? Well, because that's what humans develop a brain, right? And I mean, most of the time you can really kind of throw people off too when you go, okay, what were you like at 2 days old? And they'll tell you like, oh, I was like that. Like, what do you mean I? Are you saying there was personhood there already? Like, at what point did you become a person? And you'll find often that it kind of throws them for a loop, right? Like when I was conceived, no one says when the sperm and egg that was me, that the embryo that became me, no one even thinks that way, right? So I think I would just, I would attack the premise that function tells you what a thing is. Because that's what you're really saying, right? You're saying to be human, you have to be exercising your rational capacity.
I think to have a human soul is sort of what I was saying. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. So like to like that, because unless there's like a difference that I'm missing between the distinction between like an animal.
No, yeah, I mean you're exactly right. Like your argument is a solid, like that's I'm not faulting like the thinking to try to think that through. I'm just kind of showing you where I think the holes are in it. And it is in the fact that it's that it is a slippery slope to start thinking about measuring by function, right? Because a rational soul doesn't only give you the power to be rational. Because if it did, you'd be dead when you go to sleep, right? Okay, any other, sorry, go ahead.
The second thing, to you were saying about to rationalize. I took that up in my anthropology and archaeology class, and the response I got, because we were talking about like and the response I got from the professor is we like people can't necessarily say that rationalization, like being able to rationalize and having an intellect and will is strictly human, because it comes down to the ability for animals to not necessarily at the time currently be able to communicate whether or not they can rationalize. So it's weird, but like that's the thing that people are saying. We can't say that only humans can rationalize. We can't say that only animals will.
Yeah, that's a person of bad will, because that's not an argument. That's you can never prove a negative, right? So anyone who tries to argue from a negative, like the skeptic is usually a person of bad will. I would, again, like beavers build really like honestly, it's crappy dams, right? Like, and they've been doing it for a really long time. Why haven't they got any better at it? Like we build way better dams than them. What's wrong with the beavers? Like what? Where's their, like, just because they can't communicate, like that's not the only sign of rational powers, right? The simple thing of just build a better dam, right? You're not doing it. That dam is the same dam it was like 6,000 years ago, whatever. Like you guys still haven't got any better. Like we've mastered it, right? Like we can build gigantic ones. How did that happen? Well, there must be a fundamental difference between the two things, right? So in a lot of ways, that's bad will. Like anytime, like, I mean, it's hard to call your professor out, but honestly, when someone like, it's perfectly fine to say, look, you're all you're doing is being skeptical and you have no data to prove it. Like it could also be that we're actually, the beavers are all watching us on closed circuit TV and we have no idea. Prove me wrong. Prove me wrong, right? Like it's just not, there's no evidence. Like if you're a real scientist, you know what you do when there's no evidence? You don't speculate. Right? If you want to speculate, well, now you're into philosophy and now you're letting your worldview out. Surprise, material science doesn't know what immaterial consciousness is. Almost like they're using the wrong instrument. All right, somebody else have their hand up? All right. I'm gonna skip those two because we already talked about it. All right, so these are the flip side arguments coming from the other side. All right, it's a human being, but not a person. And again, we can add to this if you guys want to. Personhood develops gradually, so it's only a potential person. Life begins at birth. The fetus is not a person, but a part of another person. All right, so let's first start with the skeptic, all right, which I didn't really put up there, but and we can look at this like little Punnett square to see what the reasonable thing would be. Okay, so if someone says, oh, well, no one knows, which is what they said in Roe versus Wade. No one knows when life begins. Okay, anywhere else in life, in the world, when we're unsure whether something is a person, what do we do? What is the rational thing to do? So if I'm driving down the road at night and there's something that looks like a body in the road, do I hit the gas and go really fast, go over the top of it and go, oh, that was soft like a body, that probably is a body? Or do I stop and see what it is before I run it over? What is the rational thing to do? You err on the side of life, right? Like if I see something, if I'm out hunting and there's a deer and he has an orange sweatshirt on, like he could have got caught up in an orange sweatshirt. I don't know. Like, why would a person be running through a field where I'm hunting? I shoot and then I'll find out when I go to pick up the meat, what it is. Yeah, but the point is, like, it's absurd, and nowhere in life do we act like that except here. So again, we know that rationalizing is going on, right? So if it is a person, and you know that it's a person, that's called murder. It is a person and you don't know that. So my thing of running over the body in the road, like that's still manslaughter, right? Like I had reason to think that might be a body. I should probably not run it over. It's not a person and you know that. You know it's not a person. Well, it's morally reasonable. You can do whatever you want to it, right? You know it's not a person, but that's what they're saying we can't know. And then the last, it's not a person and we don't know, that's still negligence, right? Maybe the thing in the road turns out to be a mannequin, right? And I run over it. Well, I got lucky that I didn't actually run over someone. Yes, Keegan.
So there's something in the road, but there's like nowhere else to go on the road, and your son's bleeding out in the back of your car. Do you stop and see if it's a person, or do you just like try to avoid it, but you can't really if you want like this thing or something? So it's like if the argument is like it's such a burden on the mother that like her whole life will be ruined if this thing, then the fact that there might be some doubt makes it a lot more like it's not as this like the Punnett Square, obviously. I don't really know how you can argue with that, but I think the thing that's missing is that burden.
Yeah, so remember, this is just for the skeptic, first of all. But the second thing I would respond to you that, well, actually, the kid bleeding out in the back seat is the one causing the burden, so I'll just throw him out in the road too, right? Like that's essentially what they're saying is, like, it doesn't really matter whether there's a person in the road or not. And guess what? I just got rid of the burden, right? Like now I don't even have to worry about it. So yeah, I mean, again, this is the skeptics view, like the Roe versus Wade of saying like, hey, we can't know. Well, if we can't know, then we better find out first, right? Before we make a policy and kill 60 million children in the meantime. What are you saying, Connor?
Just kind of I think Keegan brought it up in kind of a different way earlier, but there seems to be there seems to be a point where we're kind of getting to the point in society now where we bring up these like extreme cases, and then there's always somebody who can say, well, actually, that person really thinks that. How many people do you think how many people do you think, okay, on the pro-choice side are just like misled, don't really care, they're just kind of misled, that's what they've been told, and they think that's right. Then there's another group of people that are doing it just because probably majority politicians, so they do it because it's convenient and it's powerful and they don't really want to have to change because they'll lose their power. And there's another group of people who are just so far like off the reservation, they've actually now internalized and logically.
Yeah. So the way to snuff those people out, honestly, I've had conversations with people before about this. I will concede to them that you can commit abortion with rape and murder. I mean, rape and incest. I will say, okay, I'll give that to you. Is that okay? Then you agree, then every other abortion should be wrong. And the person of bad will say, well, no, that's not what I mean. Right. So I concede to them. And this is exactly like there's states that are doing that now, right? They're like, okay, abortion's only legal for rape and incest. And yet they were using that as an excuse all along, and now they're not happy with it. Right. And I'm not saying that rape and incest is right. I'm just saying if I were willing to concede it, let me see what they say. And it always turns out, oh, really what we want is abortion on demand. We were just playing when we use that example just to get you to, because in no other way do we use like, I mean, that's called lifeboat ethics. That's how we teach. They teach ethics now from exceptions, right? Well, if you have no rules, there are no exceptions, but an exception doesn't necessarily, like, it's an exception for a reason, right?
The second question is kind of bringing up like the rape and incest examples. Do you know statistics on like how many? Because I've heard like the majority of abortions are from like married women. Like it's not.
Yeah, it's minuscule. The rape and incest argument is, I mean, it's a tiny number. It's a tiny percent. Yes, Mike.
Yeah, I think with that, I Googled it once and like when Planned Parenthood's like research part.
Guttmacher.
Yeah.
Guttmacher Institute.
I read it. It's like
Less than 1% are from rape.
because the other example you get is like, which again we can kind of disagree with, but like a 16-year-old girl who, her timeline. Yeah, because I've heard it said like, well, actually, really most people who are actually getting abortions are not. Like it's women who may already have children who are married who just don't want it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it tends to be, like, so get us off track, but it tends to be once a woman does it once, she now punishes herself and does it a second time. Like there's a psychological like switch that goes off because she's like, I don't deserve to be a mother, right? And so she ends up doing it multiple times. Okay, so that's the argument from skepticism. We already kind of talked about this. Yes, Ryan.
Within the bracket of different groups that kind of laid out, I had the discussion with someone, and then one of the before, where I was like, well, life begins at conception. Her response to me as scientist was, well, that's just your religious view. Like, she wants to study, I don't know what she's doing now, but like her intention was to study like world cultures or something in college. I'm sitting here a biochemist already at NC State, and her response is, life beginning at conception is your religious belief, which is that kind of irrational. You just shut down.
Well, yeah, I mean, a younger person, that's just they're just like, it's just diarrhea. It's just they're spouting off.
It's internalized.
Yeah, it's just, they've gotten, brainwashed, literally brainwashed, and they're like, let me say this, right?
But it's like, how do you respond to that? Because it's not just trash on your mind. How do you continue the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I would just simply say, well, how do you know it's only a religious argument? Like, what would a scientific argument look like? Right. So you just play dumb. Be like, well, I thought that was a scientific argument. So what would one look like then? Right. All right, we can kind of fly through this because Patrick's question was pretty much all over this. It's a human being, but not a person. A human being is a person and thus intrinsically valuable if they have the present capacity to exhibit certain properties or functions, sentience, ability, reason, self-awareness, whatever. We talked about functionalism already, to define a person by his or her functioning or behavior. All right, so let's then see if we can come up with a definition of a person. Right, and this is another way to sort of tackle your question. All right. Okay, so a person is someone who is presently performing some of the personal acts. So some unique acts to what it means to be a person. All right, and we already gave some of these examples. Someone who's sleeping isn't currently using his reason, so he's not a person. Okay, so person of goodwill goes, okay, we're not, maybe that's a bad definition. Yes.
What do you mean by some of the personal?
Well, it is in the process of like uniquely personal. Patrick's example is a good one. We could go for rationality exclusively, right? See, here's the problem, Keegan. Like, I'm skirting this issue. Who decides what those actually are, right? Well, it's the person in power, right? So let's just say rationality. Yeah. All right, so a person, all right, so you're like, okay, someone's sleeping, obviously a person. All right, so there's somebody with, at least they have the capacity to perform some personal acts. So the sleeping person can actually use their reason. All right, they're just not presently doing it. All right, sort of like when you're in college. Right? You have the ability to do it, you're not. So then, okay, now we got to throw out people in a coma. Right? Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, right? Okay. But remember, we're working toward the definition, right? So someone would not say, okay, well, then that's our definition. Yes. Yeah, so coma, like sleeping, you aren't exercising rationality. A coma, like your brain is not functioning. So like if you know, like neuroscience in the soul would be a really good. Yeah.
So it's like with the coma, the person's brain is performing all.
Usually vegetative, like that's really, I mean, usually that's all, right? They're not sensitive to touch. Like just the whatever the vegetative powers using the back of the brain are the only things operative. And that might not even be the case completely. So they may never get the brain, they may or may not ever get the brain function back that allows them to do those things. All right, sorry. Was I leaning on it? What did someone tell me? All right. Okay, so 3, a person is one with a present capacity for performing future acts. So now we're getting a little, yeah. And then we'd say, okay, at a certain point, someone's a person and they can't do anything in the future because they're dying. Right? And you see how like all these things end up getting attacked, right? Except sleeping, as no one has yet attacked sleepers. It's coming. It's coming. There's a. All right, so let's see if we can come up with a definition. Then. So this is actually John Paul II's definition from his philosophical book called The Acting Person. A person is someone with an inherent capacity for performing personal acts, given the right conditions, including time and growth. And this includes all persons, even those still in the womb. All right, so in other words, doing follows being, not the other way around. Okay. All right, I'm going to start picking up just a little bit of speed here.
So for someone dying,
Yeah, like not being able to, you mean like losing capacity, you mean? Yes. Yeah. I mean, they still have the capacity to do it, right? Just like, again, going back to our argument last week about like infertile couples, right? They still have the capacity to do it because they're those kinds of like marriage is that kind of a thing, even if they're not exercising it, or even if there's something in the way of them exercising. Human nature, right? Like that's where we're getting to, right? Yes, Connor.
I think I'm just going to pass it. I mean, ultimately, the way we would define a person is someone who has a soul, right? That's more like a definition that's understandable by a materialist.
What? Maybe.
Because I mean, I would think if we wanted to say like what makes like a fetus human, we say, well, it has a soul, but a materialist doesn't accept that argument. So we basically have to break down what a soul is to a person, to a thing that someone materialist would actually understand. So, well, it has these capacities, or has the potential to activate these capacities.
Yeah. Yes.
You don't have a solid chosen to believe would be hesitant to admit to a soul. They wouldn't be willing to define it because I can't say it. And so some of it would come back.
Consciousness.
Yeah,
You know, like, we'll admit
Yeah,
those things.
right.
So whatever we call that thing.
Yeah, but the problem is consciousness turns the soul, like takes the soul, but then also like kind of implies an alternate functionality. Right? Because you can be unconscious.
Yes, but there is something that is consciousness, and we're just saying that that's there, you know, at least in its potentiality. Then we're just calling that a soul.
Yeah.
Like in talking about it, so this is funny, but it's so it's like talking to my sister. If I use the term, because I have like a use the term, have the ability to rationalize like, an intellect and a will. Well, those words don't mean anything to her, but to say I have the ability to think things through and choose something contrary to what my like immediate instinct would say, like that. Those phrases are gonna.
Yeah, and I mean, in general, like you talk about it, and I asked them about ideas. Have you ever had an idea? Where's the idea? Is the idea in your brain? Could I open up your brain and look at your idea? Like, are all your ideas downloaded into your brain? Can I see them? And well, no, they wouldn't, because it's, they've looked at brains. There's no ideas in there. Like,
I've definitely heard people say like, oh, this is probably what, maybe it's a little less precise than that. But I
yeah,
definitely-
that's just stupidity though, right? Like you can't, like,
They don't have it.
yeah, like they have bad ideas, right?
I wasn't, sorry.
So they have brain, maybe their brain is damaged and they don't have any ideas in it. I don't know, but like that would be the way I would just ask the question. Be like, well, where are your ideas that you have?
And I wasn't saying it so much that I wasn't saying the definition is that, more just trying to get at I guess that the way we as like the intellectual tradition, as Thomas would find a person and say, well, you have a soul that makes you a person. That definition is more something that's actually intelligible to people who don't accept that.
Yeah, and the other question you ask them is, okay, when someone dies, what's different? Right? Why was someone alive 5 minutes ago and they're not now? What happened? All right, last for abortion, and we're going to move on. I have other stuff, but before we're here, so potential person was the other argument that Roe versus Wade used. That's just verbal gymnastics. Okay, a thing can't be potential. Well, and if it is, you have to tell me what it is currently. Right, so potential Y is currently X. Right. Yeah, it's just a game, a word playing game. So again, when someone uses that term potential person, I just simply ask, okay, what were they before that? Normally you'll get, well, there's people who make stupid arguments like, well, if you're going to be that way, then all that sperm that dies. And normally I just say to them, well, yeah, you may be a grown-up sperm, but I'm not. Like that's like those are not actual living people. I hate to tell you. Like maybe that explains why you think the way you do. So, but the idea again, like you have to call people out when they have like these verbal gymnastic games they play, and just very simply, just okay, if it's a potential person, what is it currently? And guess what? They don't have an answer. They'll try to use fetus, they'll try to use embryo, and then just keep asking, what is that? What is that? Why? How is it? Well, do all species have embryos? Well, what's the difference between that embryo and the frog embryo? Are they different? Why are they different? So you just keep kind of arguing back, right? Is embryo a thing? No, not really. Does embryo have its own nature? No, because each species seems to have an embryonic stage, right? All right. I haven't even gotten to like the controversial part. All right, so capital punishment. All right, we're gonna come at this a little differently because okay, we're just gonna come at it differently. You'll know why when we do this. All right, what's the purpose of punishment?
Justice.
Okay, so primary end is reestablish of justice. What else? So it has a medicinal, right? So those are the two primary ends of punishment, right? So punishment restores justice. How does it restore justice though? What's important about the act of punishment itself? It has to be what? Proportional to the crime, right? And then what are its other purposes? So medicinal, that's two. What's the last one? Does anyone know? Go ahead. Anyone spit it
I
out?
have a question.
Okay.
Protection of
A deterrent, like instructive or being a deterrent. All right, so those are the three purposes of punishment. Yes.
Is medicinal always is medicinal in the nature of punishment?
Yes. Yes, it always has to be corrective in some way. Why don't we come back to that? Because that would be a total like twisting away from where we're going. But hold I don't mind answering it at the end. Because there is such thing as like being irredeemable, right?
Because I definitely see definite term is always in there, and definitely restorative.
Because not all
justice.
punishment is medicinal. It depends on the mode of the receiver, right? The one receiving the punishment. It may be medicinal in nature, but it doesn't.
You could also argue that, I don't know, could you also argue that that alcoholic isn't properly a punishment in the sense because it's a choice and people don't choose punishment for themselves?
No, I think you would have to call it a punishment. I mean, it's definitely a punishment, even though it's not probably, it's unpopular to call it that, but it is a punishment. I mean, it's the natural effect of sin or consequence, however you want to call it, but in a certain respect, but it is different because it's eternal, right? But that is more in the nature of the creature being punished versus the act of punishment. All right, yes.
Punishment, because like pop culture will say, that gets people. That's not the case. And so I'm just like backtracking language a little bit to make it clear.
Yeah.
It's not
Well, for the time being, we will just say temporal punishment has these effects. Okay, just to keep it clear and not jump all over. All right, so this is the catechism. This is paragraph 2266. All right, so really important part of this that I want you to hold on to is it must be proportionate to the gravity of the offense. Okay, that's the most important part of what we're going to talk about for the rest of the time. All right, let's talk about the death penalty then. All right, so where did the death penalty come from? God. All right, so in Genesis chapter 9, he tells Noah, anyone who sheds the blood of a human being, by a human being shall that one's blood be shed. For the image of God have human beings been made. All right, so why? What's the why? Okay, so what word do we have for that? Dignity, like because the human being is okay. So let's immediately push away any arguments against capital punishment that have to do with the dignity of the human person, because it's actually, according to Scripture, an argument for. Because human beings are so valuable that it might be possible for somebody in response to a murder to take the life of the offender. All right, that's all we're going to commit to at this point.
So essentially that by like committing a murder or killing someone, you committed an offense against like the dignity of the human, and by not like properly, I guess like preparing that, by not proportionally responding to that, you're letting that like offense against human dignity stand.
Yeah, so most of the time the argument is capital punishment is wrong because it's against the dignity of the human person. All right, but that was why capital punishment was right. Can't have it both ways, right? So dignity of the human person is a two-edged sword, right? So anyone who says to you, well, dignity of the human, this is again seamless garment type thinking. God said because of the dignity of the human person that somebody could shed the blood of another man who's killed somebody. Right? And we'll talk about who the somebody is, competent authority, right? Because where does all authority come from? God. Okay, so who is actually exercising the authority? God, right? All right, so everybody clear on that. So we're just gonna, that typical argument of the dignity of the human person, we're gonna throw out because it's at best ambiguous, but in truth, it actually is the reason why God commanded Noah to exercise the death penalty. Everybody clear on that? Like that argument doesn't fly. Okay, yes, Aaron. Okay, can we come back to that when we talk about proportionality?
I wouldn't, because it doesn't even seem like he's necessarily, I guess it depends on you. Because for instance, if I were to spit on a crucifix, it wouldn't be a sin because we didn't need the word. It's because of who it's representing in the sense that it really.
Well, that's why the human person has dignity. Like ultimately, right? This is why in the end, like an atheistic culture always degrades human life because they can't see the image of God. It's just an event, it's just a trousered ape, right? And that's ultimately like So in a certain reason, this is why it always kind of falls back to being a religious argument, because it is, because the only reason why human beings are valuable is because they're made in the image of God. Ultimately, right? And we call that their dignity, but that's how they're made. Yes, Ryan.
What about the point that makes you just as bad? Of like, okay, if I kill someone, what? And then if person A kills a person B, if I kill person A, what makes me better than person?
Well, what makes you not better first is you don't have the authority to exercise that, right? So the common authority is a big piece of this. Yeah. Yeah, you as a general, no, but you as governor of the state, like you are the competent authority responsible for the common good, then it's not really you, but you are God's agent in that. Yeah. Go ahead. No, there's no like justification for vigilantes, right? You be Daredevil though. Daredevil's great. Yeah, he won't ever kill anybody. Yeah, but the other part, Daredevil's Catholic too, which is really awesome. Yeah, really. Oh, dude, if you have Netflix, you have to watch Daredevil. It's really violent. Like you can just skip over. Yeah, but it's really violent, but it's really good. Really like his way of dealing with like how he wrestles with the fact that he's fighting evil and he keeps getting pulled into it a little bit is really well done. Sure, I'll try my best. Sorry. All right. So now we're going to go towards Aaron's question. All right. So are there some crimes in which the only proportional punishment is death? Give me one. Murder. Okay. So Aaron thinks child rapist. We maybe would disagree on that. Maybe.
I think that like murder is like, what else would be proportional to taking someone else's life?
Okay, so I would agree that that we'll just go for right now with a single murder. Right? Single murder.
I was
Yes.
gonna say, I was gonna say you make an argument from increasing proportionality. So let's even say we could agree one murder gets you 20 years. Okay, what about 2, 3, 4? Okay, what if somebody killed 100 people? How do you maintain the proportionality if the sentence is just
You just basically made the argument for why the death penalty has to be a thing. Now, how it's exercised, totally different thing. But we would all agree, okay, we'll say one murder gets life in prison. Okay, that's we're going to say that's proportional, life in prison. What if I murder 75 people? Well, there's a problem with proportionality, right? Do I get the same punishment as someone who murdered one? Or is that so heinous that I deserve more?
So this, I guess, kind of can there be more than one punishment?
The devil's advocate has his hand up.
No. But can there be more than one punishment that is proportional for an act?
Oh, for sure. But I
So
think for
you'd say
murder,
the death penalty is a proportional penalty for murder, but it's not necessarily the only proportional penalty.
no, I mean, you could certainly argue life in prison is proportional. But what I'm going to say, and then Patrick, what I'm going to say is there is a tipping point though, where life in prison, which we might put a child rapist in life in prison, that if you do not have the death penalty, you will lose proportionality. Right, everybody follow that?
Yeah,
Like,
if you commit that.
There has to be a tipping point at which the death penalty is the only proportional way and the only way to maintain proportionality anyway.
And you would say that because that's just the worst. I'm just saying, like, okay, so you kill a person. What if you kill the person who killed 2 people and we got a person with 75 people? Is it just because that's the height to which we are able to punish people?
Yes, like there has to be a worse, like the worst crime, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like, but there has to be a certain point, and this is where the competent authority comes in, right? And this is why you have to leave. This is why the ambiguity of which the church is teaching this now is not good. There has to be a point where the death penalty is acceptable and the only proportional punishment. Where that point is, we could argue about. But if we take death penalty off the table completely, we lose all proportionality for punishments. Right? Because now the child rapist and the person who killed 175 people are getting the same punishment. So what do I have to do? I have to actually get the child rapist, punish him less. And you see how there's this gravity keep pulling back until there's no punishment.
So basically, because if there's a crime, which is like, or, there's an evil which is not like the worst conceivable evil, but which is like the punishment for which is like the worst, or I guess the most, yeah, the maximum punishment of like life in prison. There's still other worse crimes, and so by limiting yourself to this finite maximum of punishment, you're then destroying proportionality because there's still worse crimes that can be committed.
And you can see in places where the death penalty has been abolished, there is now a movement to get rid of life in prison because there's no proportionality any longer. Right? And so the death penalty always has to be an option. And that's why God instituted it as an option. How often we use it, totally up to the competent authority, but this is not a pro-life issue at all. All right, if it was being exercised in a wrong way, it's being abused, all those things, those are bad and we need to take care of those. But those are not arguments for throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, Patrick.
Isn't proportionality always going to be, I guess, like, to some extent, there's always not going to be like enough proportionality with the death penalty, because the death penalty is sort of our maximum penalty. There's no real way to like have a bigger penalty than the death penalty, but it's sort of like once you institute the death penalty like at a tipping point, there's no deterrent for doing. So like if, for example, if I was a serial killer and I kill 5 people, which means I get the death penalty, there's nothing deterring me from just going out and then bombing a church with 300 people in it. There's no deterrent anymore. So doesn't it sort of always get rid of that proportionality? Isn't there always?
No, well, because there is the worst punishment you can have in temporal life is to have your life taken from you, right? And there has to be a max to it. So yeah, so are there twisted people that think that way? You're going to get those anyway. You're going to get those with people who are in life in prison, and they're like, I'm here anyway. This guard is really irritating me. I'm just going to stab him in the back of the neck. Like, what are they going to do to me? Put me in life in prison again? Okay. Right. So either way, that's a problem. And that's not a problem with that the nature of punishment. That's just a twisted up person. Right.
The problem is drawing the line too soon, right? Like,
for sure.
because you can draw the line at like 1 year in prison. There's no worse punishment.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to go from the maximum. You have to have that as an option and then work your way back. Or else justice will never be maintained. Yes, Ryan.
And for some places to in trying to establish some version of proportionality, is that when you get sentences of like 2 life sentences in prison for the same person?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, those are not really that meaningful, right? Like,
yeah, because it seems absurd. Like,
Yeah, it's just like that's
want
like,
to like they can live like.
yeah.
it's just no criminal convictions of the code.
Yeah.
Sentences are added and
So the death penalty is not a pro-life issue, right? Issue of justice for sure. Like social justice really important. Like are certain groups more likely? Absolutely. But that's a problem in society, not a problem with the actual death penalty itself. Yes, Ken.
Is there a natural, so we talk about punishment, so for instance, even in scripture, you see like eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Obviously now we basically say, okay, you're in prison, okay, maybe we're gonna kill you, and then prison's probably not the nicest, that's not the nicest place ever. But there's no, as we would probably call them under against the 8th Amendment, like kind of cruel and unusual punishments. I mean, is that I guess what's the ruling on that in terms of, okay, you cause this guy to die, well, we're gonna bite your eye, or I guess punishments beyond just kind of, we're gonna put you somewhere or we're gonna kill you. Torture, so something in that like.
Yeah, see, something like torture would be contrary to the dignity of a person, right? Like because it loses its penitential aspect, right? So, we used to call them penitentiaries for a reason, right? Like there's nothing medicinal in getting the snot beat out of you like day after day after day after day, right? Like that's to break a person, not to reform a person. So that's the problem with that. But and the death penalty, by the way, like you often hear the argument, right? Like, oh, the person won't have a chance to convert, right? Again, that's a two-edged sword because there's nothing that's going to make you more think about your mortality than you're going to die in the morning, right? Like if your life isn't in order, like if you're going to get your life in order, it's you're dying in the morning, you probably need to get right with God. Right. So that works both ways, right? And for St. Thomas, he says, well, actually, for the person, you can't argue that. And for the person that you're actually doing them an act of charity to the person who wasn't going to convert anyway, to kill them in the death penalty actually keeps them from going deeper into hell. We don't like that argument, but you know what? The more you sin, the deeper in hell you go. So it's actually to put an end to somebody's evil is actually an act of mercy, right? Yes.
I've heard, and well, I guess I've read some writings of especially early church saints. Longing is the only for like a child molester, a child priests. And so the torture isn't like medicinal at all.
Yeah, I would argue that that's maybe not torture. I mean, we just have a different definition of like what like corporal punishment. Corporal punishment is different than torture, right? Like if they were doing it over and over, like, you know, like
flogging could become torture, but like,
yeah, it's not inherently torturous. It's just corporal punishment. I do want to point out one thing. So there was a change in the catechism and the paragraph that follows this, right? So just a couple of things when you're talking to people about that. The catechism is not a magisterial book, right? It's just simply a summary of the faith for the obvious reason that people can change it. We don't change magisterial documents, right? It was changed. The second is there's a profound problem because this paragraph that I have here, the next one is the change in the death penalty where it was called inadmissible. That's not a theological term. I'm not really sure what that means. But there's no way to reconcile if you take, which we already talked about, take the death penalty off the table. There's no way to reconcile the fact that in the paragraph before it talks about the necessity for it to be proportional. Okay, so hold on to that idea of proportionality because that's the key to understanding it. And just so you don't think I'm mean or anything, you all know that before I started working with you, it's kind of ironic. I spent a lot of time with the men in Central Prison. You guys, I like you guys better. But I spent time with men who were on death row and who had conversions, and I couldn't be happier about it. So I'm not inherently like pro death penalty. In fact, if I were to like kind of label myself, I would certainly err on not using it. But I am definitely anti taking it completely off the table. And that is probably not just because it's my position, but that's the reasonable way as Catholics we should probably look at it. And so the move towards taking it off the table needs to be resisted, and we just need to explain it to people. Yes.
It would be a new long-term in like life in prison, it's solitary isolation, then just okay, the next couple months you're gonna die. And that would be a larger punishment for someone. Because like for years that's kind of thought about it.
Yeah, I mean that is a
Okay, now it's like okay, that means ended.
yeah, I mean that is a real thing that a lot of them struggle with. Like that's really, really hard. And for some of them, they would rather, like some of them would probably rather die than spend the next 50 years, you know, in that little orange area where they're in their cell by themselves, you know, 21 hours a day. And that's, you know, that's unfortunately the nature of what they've done. But it, you know, it if you understand like the nature of it, that like death is not the worst thing that could happen to them, right? In that situation, like they may even, you know, in a certain respect, I mean, I met guys who accepted what they did. They didn't make excuses. They didn't blame anybody else. They were like, I did something really horrible. They got right with God. To remain in that, literally in that hellhole, which is central prison, is hard, right? And it's hard to stay the course. And so they would have like eternally might be better off having suffered under the death penalty and not life in prison. Yes.
I'm just letting you know there was something else.
Okay. All right, go ahead, Kevin or Nicole.
So I guess it seems like you're saying you disagree with the catechism in this area. Are there like other places that you disagree, or is this seems to be like the only one?
So yeah, I think also part of it is like we're helping out with faith formation, and they're kind of basing it off of the catechism this year. So like
Mhm.
suggestions for like.
Yeah, I
other-
would say that I can't think of anywhere else where you need to be cautious about what's in the catechism. I think,
At least not the actual catechism, not the UCAT, right?
yeah, you're not using the UCAT, right? You're just using the actual catechism.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
The real one.
The UCAT, if any of you are doing faith formation, that's got some serious issues to it. No, I don't think there's anything else. Like, I think this, again, maybe in the end, when the word inadmissible is defined, maybe I wouldn't disagree with it, but it's at best vague and appears to contradict that paragraph and contradicts the Pope, meaning the office of the Pope, because plenty of popes have said it was perfectly legitimate to use the death penalty. And in fact, there were popes who actually in Vatican City, as heads of state, watched people be executed. And what they did was get the men ready to meet God, just again an act of mercy. But no, I would not say in general that you need to be cautious of the catechism. I am not more Catholic than the catechism. All right, last one, and hopefully we'll go through this pretty quick. Euthanasia. Everyone already knows what euthanasia is, and it's wrong. What I want to talk about is just the hidden aspect of euthanasia, and that is withholding nutrition and hydration. All right, so first, in order to understand this, we have to understand ordinary versus extraordinary means. All right, discontinuing medical procedures. Hey, and I quoted the catechism, by the way. Discontinuing medical procedures that are burdensome, dangerous, extraordinary, or disproportionate to the expected outcome can be legitimate. It is the refusal of overzealous treatment. Here, one does not will to cause death. One's inability to repeat it is merely accepting it. The decision should be made by the patient if he is competent and able, or if not, those legally entitled to act for patient whose reasonable will and legitimate interests must always be respected. All right, so there are these things called extraordinary extraordinary means for some medical intervention. All right, and we can kind of imagine what they are.
That's what I was gonna ask. Is extraordinary defined by current medical practice, or is it defined by the nature of things? I mean, aspirin at one point might have been.
Yeah, it's extraordinary to the person, not the treatment. So like it's on the personal level. So in other words, a person who has stage 4 cancer and they want to do some aggressive chemotherapy, right? That would be considered extraordinary because the benefit may not. So extraordinary just simply means the benefit is the question of whether the benefit is greater than the burdens. It's questionable, right? So you always look at things in terms of benefits and burdens.
I don't know, it seems like there's more to it than burdens, right? Because if you have someone who's like in a coma and you're having to, intravenously feed them food or nutrients and fluids, and at the same time have them hooked up to like pump air in and out of their lungs and electrical stimulant or something. That's not necessarily burdensome to the person in the coma, but you could argue it's like medical or it's financially burdensome to their family, but it's only burdensome to the person in the coma. It's just like, no.
Yeah. So burdensome can mean more than just like hard on their body. So it could be legitimate to go, yeah, you know what? Like this person has been, in a coma for 75 years, and we really don't think they're going to come out of it. So it would be legitimate to take them off of the breathing machine, not the food and nutrition, but the breathing machine, because the breathing machine would be extraordinary. So you can just say the burden of doing this versus the potential benefit that they're probably never going to come out of this. We can see no benefit to this, so it's all burden. And the financial issues with the family can certainly be part of that. It's not meant to be isolated to just the like, okay, this is going to really take the toll on a person. Yes, Lizzie.
So it's discussed that like nutrition is in some cases extraordinary.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a second. Do you want to come back to it when we start talking about it? Go ahead.
Michael, I'm always on all this right.
Okay. So I sort of told Andrew just a second ago that nutrition and hydration in general are ordinary means, which means you never withhold them. Okay, right? Just like you never withhold food or drink from a person who's walking around. All right. So that part is really important. All right. That is just ordinary. That's the way you treat people who are alive, and those people are alive, whether they're actively dying, quote unquote, or not, doesn't matter. Right. Whether you're prolonging their life by giving them food or drink. Well, you know what? I ate lunch today. It prolonged my life. That's the way it works. Right. Food does that. Food and water do that. All right. So you can never withhold food and drink, even if it has to be delivered intravenously and through a feeding tube. All right. Go ahead, Con.
So I guess I'm a little bit.
And by the way, the Vatican never answers questions directly, and they actually answered this one very directly.
So I guess I'm a little confused because literally you said the breathing machine would, I mean, obviously, but I would say air is a pretty ordinary thing that we all need to live with. And I wouldn't have considered a breathing machine. I'm not an expert on medical technology, but I would not have considered the breathing machine to be that much more.
Yeah, so it is different in the sense that the longer someone stays like intubated, for example, they're never going to be able to breathe on their own. Like, so it actually has a burden attached to it. Food and drink artificially, no burden attached to it.
So that's
In general, and we're going to come back to it in a second because like, see, Lizzie give me the eye because we already had this conversation.
Sorry, but you could also like look at extraordinary from another like context, right? Because the human body doesn't have a means of producing like food and hydration for itself. That's like always something that's delivered to the body, whereas the body does have a natural means of like gathering oxygen from its environment. So if the body's not capable of doing that on its own, you have to artificially and mechanically do that, and that would be another reason why you would consider it extraordinary.
Okay, so again, I will say it again, you can never withhold food and water from the person. Now here comes the exception. The exception is when they can't tolerate it, right? And you have to have actual evidence of that. So in other words, I'm giving them fluid, their kidneys have shut down. They can't move the fluid. Well, they're no longer processing fluid. Their body no longer can use it. So then you don't give it to them. Same thing with food, right? There can be a certain point where the body can't assimilate food any longer. To remove a feeding tube from someone like that, nothing wrong with that. The point is in the second case, we're letting the person die. In the first, we're killing them by starving them to death or by dehydrating them. We can never do that. Okay? Go ahead, Con.
So
I'll
is
come back
it-
to
I'm
Lizzie
sorry,
when she-
just keep kind of around this point. So is a treatment extraordinary by nature or by circumstance, in the sense that like would have
Well, there would be ones that are intrinsically extraordinary, and there would be ones that are extraordinary by circumstance.
But I guess does current medical technology have a play in that, or is that just is that completely?
Well, yeah, because like, what's the burden has everything to do with the way it's delivered, all that. So yes.
I guess when I say that, I mean, again, I'm going back to the sense of like, at one point, intravenous, food delivery was cutting edge.
Mhm.
I mean, would that have been considered extraordinary at that point?
No, because of the burden of it, right? But there are, I mean, that the way it's delivered absolutely matters. Like if they're, putting it in a blender, holding the guy's jaw open and pouring it down his throat, that's way different than a feeding tube, right? There's way more way more likely to aspirate, all that. Okay, Lizzie, what was your question? Or did I answer it? Okay, that's all I got. So, okay, go ahead.
I understand what the traffic percent of these music, but how would you argue if someone's not living on faith that if you don't? Like, I understand like the redemptiveness of suffering.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
Is there any
again,
way to
this
do
is
it?
the dignity of the human person sits on their destiny at that point. If you believe you're just going into a hole in the ground, almost impossible to argue that life is and dying well is worth it. Right? I don't know. I don't necessarily know. You guys remember Father Philip Johnson, right? So Father Philip had he was a priest in a diocese. He left, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. He had a brain tumor, inoperable, terminal, and some miraculous thing happened to him through prayers. And a lady developed a brain tumor, same exact brain tumor, This is like a famous case. She lived in Seattle. She was like a 30-year-old woman. And he went on CNN to talk to her, to talk her out of it. She still killed herself. So it's really like, if you think this is all there is and the rest of your life is suffering, it's really hard to sell someone on that.
Yeah, I saw an article on like first Colombian woman or something that said she had a backpack